I decided to do my eulogy on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When I think about the words great president, Franklin D. Roosevelt is the first president that comes to mind. He's formerly known as FDR, and words cannot describe how much he benefited our country, but today I will do my best to find those words. We lost a great man today who helped our country through World War II and through the Great Depression. FDR helped our country regain faith in ourselves as a whole and individually, and we will be forever grateful for that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in New York in Hyde Park in New York. He was born on January 30th, 1882. He was born into a family who developed their wealth throughout generations from real estate and trade. FDR was the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano Roosevelt. He did, however, have a half-brother named James Roosevelt. FDR and his family lived at their estate, and it was named Springwood. It was in the Hudson River Valley in New York. Growing up, FDR was a lucky kid. He had more than most kids at that time had. He was taught by tutors and governesses until he was 14 years old. FDR never suffered from a lack of family. He was always surrounded by people who loved him and a happy upbringing. His mother, Sarah Ann, was the most prominent person in his life, not just in his childhood, but into adulthood too. His father died when he was only 18, and his mother died when he was 59. Young ages to lose your parents at, especially your father. I can't imagine the loss that he felt at that time, and especially after losing his mother, who he was so close to. FDR attended Groton School for Boys, and it was an Episcopal prep school in Massachusetts. He attended that in 1896. His experience wasn't the greatest for him, though. He didn't seem to fit in as well as he thought he would. The boys attending Groton were all very talented in sports, and FDR was not talented in that department. He was fond of the headmaster, Endicott Peabody, and took his teachings to heart, though. In 1900, he graduated from Groton School for Boys. After attending Groton, FDR enrolled at Harvard University, a prestigious school if you ask anyone you know. Not only prestigious, but difficult to gain acceptance to. FDR had many accomplishments during this time at Harvard. He was editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper and a member of the fraternity Alpha Delta Phi. In only 3 years, FDR graduated with his bachelor's degree in history, and I thought that sounded like a record time because who graduates in 3 years? FDR became engaged to his fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, during his last year at Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt, FDR's uncle, was also the uncle of his fiancée at that time, Eleanor. The couple got married on March 17, 1905. The couple also had 5 children, whose names were Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. And his education did not stop at Harvard University. FDR attended Columbia University in New York next. He was able to pass the bar exam in 1907, but he left the school without actually obtaining a degree. When in reality, who needs a degree when you can pass the bar exam anyway? FDR was educated to the bone. I think this is something that we can all admire and aspire to be. In 1910, FDR's political nature started taking the reins. He was elected as a Democrat to the New York State Senate in 1910. He grew up in a Republican household also, so this was something out of the ordinary, and it surprised many people that he chose to be a Democrat instead of a Republican. In 1912, FDR was reelected to the state Senate. He supported Woodrow Wilson's candidacy during the Democratic National Convention. Wilson then appointed FDR as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913. FDR held this position for a while until 1920, and he specialized in the business side of the Navy. In In 1920, FDR was nominated for vice president by the Democratic Party, but Wilson ended up not winning the presidency. Warren Harding did. This wasn't the end for FDR, though. After developing poliomyelitis in the summer of 1921, while vacationing at Campbell Island in New Brunswick, FDR became enlightened. He fought against the disease as hard as he possibly could to regain the use of his legs, and he did this by taking up swimming lessons. The Democratic Convention in 1924 showed just how strong FDR was when he appeared on stage on crutches. Sadly, he was never able to actually regain use of his legs. He went and established a foundation in Warm Spring, Georgia. He then went on to direct the March of Dimes program, and this program ended up funding an effective vaccine against the disease. In 1928, FDR became the governor of New York. FDR was reelected as a governor in 1930. Also in 1930, FDR started his campaign for the presidency. FDR was a brave man. He was willing to combat the Great Depression in New York, and this made him a strong competitor in the run for presidency. Nothing scared him at all. In 1932, in Chicago, FDR won the nomination for the Democratic Party for presidency. FDR was extremely enthusiastic about this opportunity. He ended up breaking tradition by flying to Chicago to accept his nomination in person. He defeated Hoover in November 1932 by 7 million votes because of his activist approach and his overall campaign. FDR was inaugurated into presidency on March 4, 1933. During these months, the Depression started worsening. There were multiple bad things happening during this time. There were farm foreclosures, bank failures increased, and factory closings. Another downfall was the rise of unemployment. There were 13 million people that were unemployed at this time. This caused many issues for people. It was said to be the biggest crisis since the Civil War. I commend FDR for making the best out of such a terrible situation. FDR dived right into fixing the problems from the Great Depression. He closed down banks temporarily and initiated his New Deal programs. He didn't stop there, though. How could he? He worked with Congress to pass recovery legislation. This legislation set up alphabet agencies to help support farm prices and companies to employ younger men. Some other agencies helped with business and labor, aided the unemployed, and ensured bank deposits. Soon, banks reopened and prevented families from struggling any further. The New Deal had its downfalls, though. It was increasing spending and unbalanced budgets. However, the benefits outweighed the negative parts of the deal. In 1935, though, bankers and businessmen were starting to get angry with FDR and turning against his New Deal. They did not trust him and feared the experiments that he was doing. They feared these experiments because he had taken the nation off the gold standard and allowed deficits in the budget, and this is why Social Security became available to everyone. Also in 1935, another legislation of the New Deal involved the Works Projects Administration. The WPA made jobs available to laborers, writers, musicians, artists, and authors. Another benefit was the Social Security Act. The act provided unemployment compensation and a program of old age survivors benefits. Despite being the only president to serve more than 2 terms, FDR started hitting his goal in his presidential career. He went to the Supreme Court in 1937 because they said his New Deal legislations were unconstitutional. In 1938, during the election, FDR's run backfired when a lot of his Democratic opponents were re-elected to Congress. Also, a recession happened halfway through the second term. This is what represented his downfall of his presidential career, but in 1940, he was re-elected. Then we go into World War II. Hitler attacked Poland in September 1939. FDR made the United States available to help aid Britain, France, and China. FDR also made it possible to build up the armed forces. A draft for the military soon came about. FDR signed a Lend-Lease bill in March 1941 so we could aid nations at war with Germany and Italy. It was said that the United States was becoming the arsenal of democracy during the war. More jobs were being produced, just like years before the Great Depression happened. Then tragedy struck the United States. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked us out of nowhere. This was known as Pearl Harbor. Then, 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war against the United States. This is how World War II began. I can't imagine the stress our great president felt at the time. Being thrown into a situation like that had to have been stressful, but our president stepped up. He became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He worked hard too. Overriding his military advisors when it was necessary was just one of the ways. He also took an active role in choosing the field commanders and making calls that had to do with wartime strategy. FDR then made a strategy and created a grand alliance against the Axis powers. This was called the Declaration of the United Nations. It was created on January 1st, 1942. This declaration made all the nations fighting the Axis agreed not to make a separate peace and pledged themselves to a peacekeeping organization which is now called the United Nations. The Western European Front had priority, and General George Marshall, Chief of Staff, planned a holding operation in the Pacific. This was to have an invasion of Europe. The Allies and us, the United States, invaded North Africa in November 1942 and Sicily and Italy in 1943. By April 1945, victory in Europe was received. The war ended up wearing out FDR. In early 1944, after a medical examination, FDR was diagnosed with serious and circulatory problems. While vacationing in Warm Spring, Georgia in April of 1945, FDR suffered a massive stroke and he died 2.5 hours later. He was only 63 years old. He ended up serving his presidency for 4 full terms also. Today we say goodbye to a great president, a great man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We lost him at a young age, thanks to the war wearing him away, but everything he did was worth it in the end. We will never forget such an amazing, caring, loving, and hardworking man. Rest in peace, Franklin. We all miss you so much.